The English countryside stood still. A thick mist clung to the hills. Ancient oak trees stood silent. The sky was a dull grey. It mirrored the weight of the day. The only sound was the crunch of gravel. The hearse moved slowly. It approached the small church. Ivy covered the stone walls. Jane Bond stood at the edge. Her dark sunglasses hid her grief. She wore a simple black dress. Her posture was rigid. Her face was expressionless. But her heart was breaking. She watched the casket being lowered. Inside was Emily. Emily, her daughter, her sweet girl. Emily had fought bravely, but she had lost her battle. Cancer had taken her. Jane gripped the funeral program. Her knuckles were white. Beside her stood Larry Bond. He was her husband. He stood silently. His arm was around her shoulders. He was her support. His eyes were red-rimmed, but his face was strong. He hid his emotions. Larry was her rock. He had pulled her back so many times. The dog's tail wagged slowly. Lucy sensed the sadness. She had been Emily's companion. Jane crouched down. She ran her hand through Lucy's fur. She found a small comfort. It was a familiar touch. "I miss her too," Jane whispered. Her voice cracked. Lucy whined. She licked Jane's hand. Larry stood behind her. He rested a hand on her back. "Let's go home, love," he said gently. "We need some rest." Jane nodded. She stood up. They walked to their car. It was a 1968 Camaro. Larry had restored it. It was a symbol. It reminded them of their past. Jane moved through the house. She was in a daze. She replayed the past. It was as if she could hold on to it. She could almost hear Emily. Emily's laughter echoed in the rooms. She could see her small form. Emily darted around corners. She was full of life, full of energy. But now the house was quiet. It was too quiet. The emptiness was suffocating. Larry tried to comfort her. He tried to draw her out, but Jane couldn't respond. She had buried her feelings. She buried them deep inside. They couldn't be used against her. But now it was useless. She felt such profound loss. Lucy stayed close to Jane. She followed her from room to room. Jane nodded. She couldn't speak. She wanted to believe him. They could find peace. But a part of her knew better. The part scarred by violence, scarred by betrayal. Peace was fragile. It was easily shattered. Days passed. Jane tried to find solace. She gardened, she cooked, she walked Lucy, but the grief remained. It was a constant shadow. It lurked beneath the surface. She couldn't escape it, no matter how hard she tried. One morning the air was crisp. It smelled of fallen leaves and wood smoke. Jane and Larry returned home. They had been to the grocery store. Their bags were full of simple necessities. Lucy trotted alongside. Her tail wagged. She sniffed the ground. She was happy. They pulled into the driveway. But he didn't move. The world slowed down. The sounds around her faded. Jane felt for a pulse. Her hands trembled. There was nothing. He was gone. The realization hit her like a freight train. Through her tears, she noticed something. It was in his pocket, a small folded note. With shaking hands, she pulled it out. Questions raced through her mind. The note was simple. It was scrawled in a rough hand. "Thank you for the car and the dog," it read. Below the words was a symbol. Jane recognized it instantly. It was a Russian symbol, one she had encountered before. Her blood ran cold. This was no random act. It was a message. Jane's grief transformed. It became something else, something fierce, something unyielding. She knew what she had to do, even if it meant abandoning her life, her training, her instincts. It all came rushing back, as if she had never left. She stood up, her expression hardened. She was the assassin she once was. She would find them. There was a pause, a moment of silence. "I'm sorry, Jane. What do you need?" "Everything you have on the Russian Bratva," Jane said. Her voice was cold, controlled. "And I need it now." The voice hesitated. "This won't be easy, Jane. You know that." "I know exactly what I'm getting into," Jane replied. "And I'm not asking." There was a sigh, then the sound of typing. "All right, I'll send you what I have. But Jane, be careful." Jane hung up. She didn't need to be careful. She was beyond careful. She was driven by one thing. The old farmhouse felt cold, distant. It belonged to another life. Jane was not that woman anymore. The woman who tended roses. The woman who walked her dog. She was Jane Bond, an assassin. And she was back. The sun set. Long shadows stretched across the land. Jane sat in the study. Her laptop glowed. Lines of data filled the screen. A familiar sight. She sifted through the information. Her contact had sent it. She pieced together the puzzle. It led to her husband's murder and the kidnapping of Lucy. The Russian Bratva, a criminal organization. They were involved in everything. Arms smuggling, human trafficking. They had resurfaced. Viktor Petrov, a high-ranking official. He had a reputation in London's criminal underworld. Jane had met him before, years ago, when she was still in the field. He was ruthless, cunning, more dangerous than most. Petrov was more than a politician. He was a kingpin. He used his influence to shield his illegal activities. Jane knew it in her gut. Petrov was the key. He was the key to unraveling this. She needed to get close to him, closer than ever before. But she couldn't do it alone. Jane leaned back. Her mind raced. She considered her options. She could call people. Jane didn't hesitate. She picked up her phone. She dialed the number. A gruff voice answered. "Who is this?" he demanded, a thick Russian accent. "It's Jane Bond," she replied. Her voice was sharp. "I need your help, Alexei." There was a pause. She could almost hear him thinking. "Jane Bond," he repeated. "I thought you were dead." "Not yet," Jane said. Her voice had a bitter edge. "But my husband is. I need to know why. I have a lead on Petrov." "I'll be there," Alexei replied. He hung up. Jane stared at the phone. She closed her laptop. She snapped it shut. The pieces were falling into place. Soon she would have answers, but those answers would come at a price. She was ready to pay it. The wind whispered. It rustled the trees. Jane felt a sense of clarity. The world had taken everything from her, but she would take something back. She would take back her life, her dignity, and she would make them suffer. This was just the beginning. The docks were deserted. The air was thick. It smelled of salt and oil. Jane moved through the shadows. Her senses were alert. She had chosen this location carefully. Five minutes passed. The door creaked open. Alexei stepped inside. He was tall, broad-shouldered. His hair was graying, but his eyes were sharp as ever. He closed the door. His gaze swept the room. It settled on Jane. "Jane Bond," he said. His voice was low. "You look different." "Life changes people," Jane replied. Her expression was blank. "But you haven't changed, Alexei." He smirked. There was amusement in his eyes. "I could say the same about you." Alexei stared at her. He nodded slowly. "All right. I know some people. People who can get us close to Petrov, but it won't be easy. He's surrounded. Guards. He lives in a fortress. His own making." Jane nodded. She was already planning her next move. "I don't need easy. I need results." Alexei smiled. It was a dangerous smile. "Then you've come to the right place." Days passed. Jane and Alexei worked. They gathered information. They built a plan. They moved through the city, the underbelly of London. They used old contacts. They called in favors. Jane and Alexei followed Ivanov to an underground casino. It was a place for the rich and powerful where they indulged their vices. Jane wore a black dress, her hair pulled back. Alexei posed as her bodyguard. They entered the casino, the air thick with smoke and tension. Cards shuffled, glasses clinked. They spotted Ivanov at a poker table surrounded by people, men and women dressed to the nines. Jane moved through the crowd, her eyes never leaving Ivanov. She slid into an empty seat, and all eyes turned to her. "May I join?" she asked, her voice smooth and confident. Ivanov looked her up and down, then smiled, a predatory smile. By all means, he replied, signaling the dealer. Jane played with precision, her focus unwavering from Ivanov. She knew how to read people, how to manipulate them with a smile or a gesture. The game went on as she started a conversation, slowly gaining his trust. By the end of the night, Ivanov was drunk and infatuated. He couldn't resist her. Jane coaxed him and he gave her information about a shipment Petrov was expecting. It was something big and dangerous. The pieces were coming together. Jane was closer, but time was running out. The night was ending. Ivanov leaned in, his breath smelling of alcohol. You know, he slurred, Petrov has a type. Beautiful women, like you. Maybe I could introduce you. Jane smiled, her eyes cold. I'd like that, she replied, already planning the next step. Back at the safe house, Jane and Alexei talked and reviewed the information. The shipment was due to arrive soon. It was clear Petrov was involved in something bigger, something far more sinister. The conspiracy was unraveling. Arms dealers, corrupt officials, and now a terrorist organization called the New Dawn. Jane had heard whispers of a shadowy group responsible for devastating attacks, and at the center of it all, a man named Draven. The name hung in the air. Draven. A chill ran down Jane's spine. Draven was a ghost, a myth. He haunted the intelligence community. No one knew his face, but his name meant one thing: chaos and destruction. If he was involved, everything changed. The stakes were higher than ever. Jane and Alexei studied the data, and a plan began to form. They would intercept the shipment and use it to get to Petrov. From there, they would climb up the chain to Draven. It was a risky plan, requiring precision and luck, but they had no other choice. This is bigger than the Bratva, Jane said, her voice steady despite the dire situation. This is bigger than anything I've ever seen. We need to be ready for anything. Alexei nodded, his face grim. I've looked death in the eye before, Jane. I'm not afraid, but we have to move fast. If Draven is involved, time is our enemy. Jane agreed. Her mind raced. She was no stranger to danger. This was different. This was personal. She would see it through, no matter the cost. The night was cold, dark. The moon hid behind clouds. The city was draped in shadow. Jane and Alexei were prepared. They had spent days planning meticulously, every detail. They were ready. Their target, a warehouse, heavily guarded, on the edge of London. That's where the shipment was headed. Jane was in position, on a rooftop, overlooking the warehouse entrance. She was dressed in black, a shadow. Her sniper rifle was steady. Below, Alexei moved silently. He was a wraith in the darkness. He approached the entrance. He was ready. He would breach on her signal. They had synchronized their watches. The shift change. Security would be weakest then. Jane's heart pounded. Adrenaline surged. She watched the guards. They moved in and out, precise, disciplined. Through her scope, Jane saw them. Black SUVs, approaching. Her pulse quickened. This was it, the shipment. The vehicles stopped. Men emerged. They unloaded crates. Jane saw the symbol, the Russian insignia, the same one, from the note. Jane breathed slowly. She steadied herself. She focused. Viktor Petrov. He stepped out of an SUV, an imposing figure, unmistakable. Armed men surrounded him. Their faces were hard, alert. Petrov moved with confidence. He thought he was untouchable. Jane would show him. Alexei, Jane whispered into her earpiece. The shipment's here. Petrov's here. Report. In position. Alexei's voice came through, calm and focused. On my mark, Jane replied. She took aim. Her crosshairs settled on a guard near Petrov. The seconds ticked by, each one an eternity. Jane's finger hovered over the trigger. She waited. The guards were clustered. She pulled the trigger. The guard dropped. Chaos. Petrov roared. Alexei moved with lethal grace. Jane provided cover. They had the element of surprise. The warehouse lights flickered. Darkness. New figures. Tactical gear. Professionals. Alexei, we have company, Jane warned. Unknown hostiles. Copy that, Alexei replied. A blinding explosion. Jane was thrown back. She fought to see. Through the smoke she saw them, closing in on Alexei. She drew her sidearm. She had to reach him. To be continued. Jane's blood ran cold. She watched helplessly as Alexei was engulfed by a wave of black-clad figures. She raised her pistol, her finger tightening on the trigger. But it was no use. She had come so far, endured so much, only to be thwarted at the last moment. But Jane Bond was not a woman to be easily defeated. It was a last resort, a beacon designed to transmit her location. This was far from over.